Good afternoon, or good morning, depending when you're watching this. So, I am here in the sacristy of the church. The sacristy is like the kitchen of a house. The sacristy is where we keep our sacred vessels that we use at Mass. And we're here behind the scenes because we've just finished the daily Mass, and we're going to be setting up for our Friday school Mass. And while we do that, I'm going to be showing you some of the sacred things that we use in the Mass as we prepare for the Mass tomorrow. And I'm gathered here with Mrs. Bissett. Mrs. Bissett is the mother of an alumna, Cora, who graduated 4 years ago. And we're assisted by Mr. Wathen, who is working the camera, and he will show his face now, climbing under the wire. And the reason why I wanted to show you about setting up for Mass is because most of you, except our altar servers, don't really get an experience of what goes on behind the scenes. So this video is called Behind the Scenes, Preparing for Mass. But first of all, we're going to be cleaning up after the Mass that we just celebrated. And then in the process, we'll be setting up for tomorrow's Mass. And at the end of the video, I'm going to explain to you the spiritual reason why we set up way in advance for tomorrow's Mass, and that'll be with us with the school. So first of all, Mrs. Bissett is going to take the burse off of the chalice and then take the chalice veil, which is colored purple. That's the color of the season. She's going to set that aside momentarily. Then she's going to take the pall, the square, hard covering for the chalice that is useful, especially in hot weather, to keep the flies and the gnats away from the bread and the wine. Then she's going to take the small ceborium, which is the bowl we hold the bread in, that then becomes the body of Christ. She's going to wipe it down just to make sure any leftover moisture is clear from it. We're not going to use this bowl because we're going to use a bigger one for the school Mass. She can set that aside for Saturday. And in her hand is the purificator. The purificator is like a napkin that we might use at the dinner table that purifies the chalice, keeps it clean, and wipes it after I have drunk from it. So she's going to likewise make sure all moisture is away from the chalice as we prepare a new purificator for tomorrow's Mass. And after she does that, she's going to place the purificator in the sacred laundry, which is the bin below the Sacristy, which I will explain in a moment. And our ladies who take care of the sacred laundry will pick up the used purificators, and they'll very carefully launder them at home and bring them all back nice and folded and ironed. So now we're going to empty out the finger bowls that we have used at this Mass, and we're going to empty them out in the Sacristy, which is the sacred sink. The sacred sink has a pipe that doesn't go into the sewer, but it goes straight into the ground. So the water that we've used at Mass, we pour down the holy sink. And that other finger bowl here, I have used to dip my fingers in at communion time, and especially that water might hold little particles of the sacred host, so we don't want it just to put it down any old sink. We put the water down the sacred sink, out of respect for the body of Christ. And now for the Mass tomorrow, she's going to refill this for my fingers to be used at communion. And that's just ordinary water. We'll put that ready. Then we're not going to use this one, but we're going to use the larger finger bowl and pitcher, because we'll have servers tomorrow who can handle that. And then the finger towel will go on top. All right, now we're ready to, we'll refill the water cruet. The cruets that hold the water and the wine are like the containers that we might use at home that hold the oil and vinegar for salad. Now, this is not vinegar, this is wine, and this is ordinary water. But the cruets, it's the same word that we would use for those containers that we use at salad for a meal at home. So there's a lot of comparison between the meal of the Mass and our meals at home, like supper. And now we're going to be preparing the chalice. The chalice is, that's a very special word, which means, guess what? Cup. It's a word from the Greek and the Latin, which simply means a cup. But we use the fancy word chalice because this is a really special meal. So Mrs. Bissett is going to build up the chalice with the various cloths. Okay, first of all, we place the new purificator on the chalice that's all nice and clean and folded and ironed. That's the napkin, sacred napkin. And then on top of that, we place the pall, which is the square hard covering. And that's going to be useful because it's going to help us put the chalice veil over it. That'll help it hold some shape. And since tomorrow is a day of Lent, we'll use the purple cloth again. See how nicely it fits over the chalice? You need that pall to keep it in shape. And then we place the burse. And by the way, the word burse is very similar to the word purse because it's a small bag-like container that holds the corporal, which is, and the corporal is compared to the table mat that you would place your plate on and the silverware. So it's a square cloth. This is a very fancy design. I'm not going to hold it up straight because it might just have sacred particles left in it. Now it looks like we've been very careful and it's clear of sacred particles from the Mass. And if it did, we would shake it out in the Sacrarium before we use it again. But I'm not going to hold it up and shake it because it's a very sacred piece of cloth. So this is comparable to that table mat, placemat that we would put at our places at the table. And for the larger Masses, we use 2 of these corporals because we'll be putting out more than one Ceborium, which is that bowl that I'll mention in a moment. And now we're going to be placing the bread that we'll consecrate into the Ceborium. And the Ceborium is another fancy word that simply means a bowl with a lid on it. And this is the container that members of the congregation bring forward along with the cruet of wine at the offertory time. So Mrs. Bissett is going to fill this with the bread that we will use to consecrate. And we have a little plastic container here of the bread that we have ready. And these are the congregational size hosts. And that looks like about enough to handle the school. And by the way, we have even smaller congregational hosts than this. We set them aside that we use for visits to the sick and homebound because they might not be able to swallow as well as you and I can. So when they're sick, we have smaller ones, or if they're in the hospital, we bring communion to those, and those are the smaller size hosts, even smaller than this. But we have a large one. This is called the priest host. And it's a little larger so people can see it when I hold it up after I consecrate it at the altar. And that goes in with the other congregational hosts. And the reason I like to put it with them is because we consecrate it together. And you'll say, may the Lord accept the sacrifice at my hands for our good and the good of all his holy church. And with that, I consecrate the hosts that I consume, but also the hosts that you consume. And then it has a lid on it, and that'll keep it free of any visits by any insects until tomorrow. And there's one other thing on the tray here. We have the tabernacle key. And at the beginning of Mass, we'll put this in the tabernacle, so we'll be ready to increase the number of consecrated hosts we have to distribute, if we need, to the people. Now, I mentioned that the reason that I like to prepare all these sacred items a day in advance, because if you really understand the importance of the Mass, it becomes the most important thing that one can do each day. And the Mass is celebrated here each and every day. And if you have a deep spirituality, you realize that celebrating the Mass or assisting at Mass as God's people is the most important thing that you can do any day. That means when we prepare the Mass a day in advance, we spend the whole rest of the day today preparing our hearts and minds for tomorrow's most special event. And that's what I want you to think about, that when you come to Friday Mass, that's the most important thing that you will do tomorrow. Not recess, not class, not going to the mall, not even sleeping at night. This is the most important thing. Which means that Sunday Mass is the most important thing that you do during the whole week of 7 days. Does that give you a challenge to work on? I hope it does. Well, I hope you've learned something from this video, and I thank Mrs. Bissett and Mr. Wathen for putting this video together entitled Behind the Scenes in the Sacristy, Preparing Our Hearts and Minds for the Mass.